Hey everyone, I'm Lori Timoney with Go City, and happy to have you here today with us for the Experience.This.Travel vodcast, I guess is what we call it. Today we are going to be exploring the world of multi-day tours. Lots of news these days in regard to multi-day tours. So we invited an expert in multi-day tours today to join us. Dan Christian with Travel Trends Podcast. We're really excited to have you here, Dan. And of course, we have Christian Watts with Magpie Travel and Bruce Rosard with Arrival, also co-host of Experience.This.Travel. So why don't we dive right in today? We have a lot to talk about. So Dan, you are obviously an expert in multi-day tours, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what makes you an expert in multi-day tours.
Thank you, Lori. Great to be back with you, Bruce and Christian. I love your podcast. You guys know that I'm a big fan. I'm often in the comments, and I want more people to listen and experience this podcast. So,
well done.
Very true. And obviously we go back too. I mean, we've known each other for years. And just in terms of that context, Lori, when I was coming to the first Arrival events, which Douglas Quinby kindly had invited me to, and Bruce as well, the reason for that was I was always trying to get multi-day tour on stage at Focusrite. Because for the last 15 years, I've been working with all of the largest multi-day tour brands and working with the large OTAs to convince them that this is a category that they should take interest in. So it is perfect timing given some of the private equity, VC investment, and the abundance of activity in this space that all of a sudden it is reaching main stage recognition. I know Arrival obviously tours and activities, but multi-day is a unique sector within this category. And it's always been a misunderstood category because I think a lot of people saw what they considered to be motor coach touring. You know, the idea that you would be like herded together with a large group of people on a bus, someone would get off and hold up a flag, and it had a negative stigma attached to it. And that was the case. And for many brands that as the disruption happened, especially when you started to see companies like adventure touring, which we'll talk about today as well, small group adventures, companies like Intrepid and G Adventures, and you saw the explosion of that category in the 90s and the early 2000s. And we'll talk about some of those stats today that I think will give everyone a good idea of what is a multi-day tour, what Tour Radar refers to as an organized adventure. It's a difficult category to come up with the right nomenclature for, hence there's multiple terms. I think multi-day tour is probably the best and most appropriate to encompass everything that this industry has to offer. But it's often misunderstood because people saw it as a declining market. And this is, I think, why it's shocking to everyone to see these investments and these acquisitions. So Exotica with their Series D raising 60 million euros, the Travel Corporation being acquired by Apollo, companies like G Adventures and Intrepid both being private equity backed. I was doing a keynote at the Tour Radar conference just a week ago and helping set the stage for why we're seeing this activity. And a lot of it is driven by demographics and consumer demand, which I'm keen to share more about. But I'll pause there. Hopefully that gives everyone a good idea of multi-day touring. With brands like Trafalgar, Insight Vacations, Kentucky, Globus, Colette. There are so many multi-day tour brands, and people don't often see it as a category unto itself because there's still no real global conference for multi-day tour, and it's still only the case that Focusrite, to their credit, have started to add multi-day tour conversations to the main stage. I credited Travis for recently being a main stage in Europe because he and I were often the ones fighting back to back to get representation on the main stage of the big conferences. So credit to Bruce, Douglas, and the Arrival team for starting to give this industry the credit that it's due.
Dan, can you quickly draw us a graph of the 50-year market size of multi-day? Draw it with your finger. I want to see is it going steadily up? Is it going up?
So it's going to look like a hockey stick now.
Of course it is.
So yeah, and of course I'm Canadian, so there's a hockey stick line for where we sit from 2020 and what is going to happen in the next 10 years. So I think the one thing that's difficult, and this to answer your question adequately, one of the things that has not existed is a proper market size study. So when we look at Tour Radar, perfect example. So Tour Radar came into existence 13 years ago. I was at G Adventures at the time, overseeing their global marketing and technology, and I moved on to the Travel Corporation, overseeing there's 40 brands, $2 billion in revenue, and many of the largest multi-day tour brands. And again, it was so fascinating for me to see the growth of these brands and the fact that people were not paying attention and recognizing what's happening in this category, and perception being mostly it was a declining market. When you look at Tour Radar, and I was speaking to investors then to advocate on their behalf, they were estimating the market to be a $100 billion market within the adventure tour, multi-day tour category about 10 years ago. They've now increased that to 200 billion and are now looking at this sector as a $300 billion category. And the last thing I'll say on this, I think this is where it should be exciting to all the listeners who are tuning into multi-day and trying to wrap their head around the category, is if you look at the trends for the next 10 years, driven by these demographic shifts in consumer behavior, is that the adventure category, best stats and estimates are in 2023, it was about a $350 billion industry. Expectations it's going to be a $1 trillion industry by 2030. And if you look at the players in this space, look at Intrepid, one great example. So season 4 of the Travel Trends podcast, we're focusing on adventure. We're leading off talking about multi-day and adventure, interviewing some of the biggest players in this space, Intrepid being one of them. They publish their numbers. They're a B Corp, so they put all their numbers out, and they did 650 million last year, and their plan to get to 2030 is 1.3 billion dollars in revenue. They want to double the number of passengers. If you look at Exotica and you look at that latest deal, they did 50 million, 100 million, they did 200 million last year, and from the numbers they're sharing, they're going to do 300 million this year. You've got a company like We Road, which is an exciting startup that is disrupting, creating multi-day tour for millennial travelers in Europe, that is having literally not double digit, but double growth in every major market there in Europe. They're expected to be the largest tour operator in Europe by 2030. You start adding all these numbers together, and like, how is every one of these? We've even got a startup called One Life Adventures on our podcast with this 3-part deep dive into adventure, and they've already done $10 million in business as a small startup. So how is it the case that all of these businesses are seeing that type of growth, and that this category is, is growing by 20% per year?
I think that's a really good question, Dan, and I think we should maybe unpack some of that. There are a few thoughts, I think, that, well, definitely some themes around multi-day that, to me, are really sort of a good reason why you're starting to see growth like this. And I think one of those is digitization. So this category has, obviously for years been very much manual, lots of kind of old ways of doing things in terms of tech. And if you look at, even the deal with Exotica, what is Exotica specifically, right? It's a platform. Similar to Tour Radar, it's a platform. So maybe talk a little bit about, if you would, kind of what's happening in the space, or I guess in terms of digitization in regards to this category.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I want to chime in to follow into that same question. We had Travis Pittman, CEO of Tour Radar, at an Arrival event in 2019, and saw what he was doing there. And before Exotica's recent investment, when you talk about distribution of multi-day, I haven't heard of a brand except for Tour Radar. I think a lot of our listeners don't really know exactly what Tour Radar is and does. So I think a good place to start with your answer to Lori is, what is Tour Radar? And why are they the one brand that we hear about? Who do they have other competition related to distribution? And how important is digital distribution to multi-day, which has been really, really hard to put through digital distribution?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So in terms of answering Lori's question, and then yourself too, Bruce, is that there's tour operators and then there's distribution platforms, which is exactly how Tour Radar came into the market. They're a lot more than an OTA, but the simplest way to look at them, and a lot of people think at first glance, is it's an online travel agency for multi-day tours and adventure travel. And they did start in adventure. That is Travis's background. And so when you look at the businesses that were first on the platform, it was G Adventures and Intrepid. They now have 2,500 tour operators globally on their platform. And the reality is, though, and when we speak about Exotica, this is where it gets much more interesting when you see the landscape today, is that traditionally you've had tour operators. So G Adventures, Intrepid are tour operators, a travel corporation, or tour operators. They own and operate those brands. There are some regions that tour operators, of course, don't operate their own product, and they use what's called DMCs, destination management companies, that you guys are all familiar with. Some of our listeners may not be. So they can't necessarily serve operations in all of those regions. So where they don't have an operating team, most of them typically have a core market that they is their source market, and then they have the destinations that they focus on. So if we look at the evolution of this category, a brand like G Adventures, based in Toronto, Canadian adventure travel company, but totally global now. But their focus was sending people to Peru, like Amazon, Machu Picchu. And whenever you look at these tour operators, you almost see this. Intrepid started in Australia, Melbourne. Their main focus was Cambodia, and so Angkor Wat. So like when you look at any tour operator, when you're trying to assess their business and potential, it's always looking at the source markets that they focus on and what are the destination markets they serve to try and get an idea of growth. And most of these businesses have been focusing on adding more destinations and adding more source markets. Most of them are still English language. Tour Radar has started to break out from that by going into markets like Germany, but most of it is English language based multi-day tours. That's an important point to highlight because it's, but what I was going to say is that all of a sudden you started to have companies that started to offer new distribution platforms for multi-day tour, like Tour Radar. The challenge, and there's Stride Travel, there's a number of other companies that have come along to introduce the kind of OTA for tours. But what's been totally misunderstood, and again, I know this really well, just having all these conversations over the last 8 or 9 years with Booking.com and Expedia and all the big players, is that they've largely ignored this sector partly because they don't understand the unit economics. Like that's one factor, because it actually is quite a lucrative space. When you look at the margins, you look at the average purchase value, which is why a lot of this product is still sold through traditional travel agencies because it's more of a high touch product. And by virtue of that, you have to train agents and make sure they go on trips, they become familiar with the product, and then they're better positioned and able to sell it. And so given the price point and the complexity, that's why it's still largely sold offline today. And so those OTA players who have experimented with it, what they've actually found is they don't currently have a market for it. They can sell flights, they can say hotels, they can even get into reservations and restaurants. They can sell day tours to everyone here's benefit. Like obviously that we've seen great growth in that. They have not yet cracked multi-day. And I actually think that the Exotica model is going to have a lot of them rethinking that when you see the growth in the trajectory and some of the things we'll talk about today. Because what Tour Radar has done, just to finish off on your question, is that Tour Radar has aggregated all of these tour operators. They can also be local DMCs. And so you can go to Tour Radar, you can search for a destination, you can see all these amazing companies you can travel with, and you're presented with a wide selection. And then you can ultimately make your decision. But you're not traveling with Tour Radar, you're traveling with one of the brands that you're going to discover through Tour Radar. Now, what's interesting about the Exotica model, the reason why it has great potential to be disruptive, and part of the reason they're seeing such significant growth and investment, is because when you book with Exotica, you are actually traveling with Exotica, even though you actually are traveling with a local DMC that they work with. And what I mean by that is you're not on Exotica searching through different tour operators. You're booking a trip with Exotica, and then one of those destination management companies is operating that on behalf of Exotica. And this is where it actually becomes quite disruptive, because if you look at the layers of distribution, you have the tour operator, you have the intermediaries, and they're taking out that intermediaries. You're working directly with a local DMC. And one of the things they're introducing, which is something that is quite controversial in our space, is massive discounting. So if you go to the Exotica website today, you'll see that a lot of the product is 50% off. And so that is presenting a new challenge for the industry in terms of how this product is priced, and bringing up new questions about the model. So it's
talk about that for a second, because distribution of multi-day to date has been primarily travel agent, right? I mean,
correct.
That's, and probably still 70+% travel agent. Tour Radar started about 10 years ago to bring it online. I want to understand how I, as a traveler wanting to go to Cambodia, to go to Angkor Wat and Siem Reap and et cetera, might book something through Tour Radar or through Exotica. Because now you're saying Exotica is actually a tour operator who happens to get their inventory from DMCs, add their markup, which typically are 50% plus margins. Maybe they're discounting by that, but where's the merchant of record? Where's the customer service? Does Exotica have their own call center with experts in Cambodia and Peru and wherever they might be, versus TourRadar doesn't really have a call center, I don't think. I know originally they were about more of a call model. Like, how do people really aggregate and then sell and buy MultiDay?
Yeah, really great question. Laura, you can add to that?
To that point, and when you talked a little bit about the DMC aspect, I mean, that's not really new news. DMCs have been providing product and running tours for tour operators for many, many, many years. So that piece of it is actually not something that's kind of just being introduced at this point.
No,
It
it's not,
seems to
but
me
it's a
it's
tech
distribution.
platform that is. I mean, Intrepid has a network of what, over 100 DMCs that are part of Intrepid, that is probably providing the inventory for Intrepid tours, right?
Exactly, yeah. So you guys are highlighting an important point, which is exactly how this model has evolved over time. So DMCs have always played an important role. That's no question about that. The difference is that technology is allowing people to go directly to DMCs, or to essentially, as each of these brands have grown, they've acquired more businesses to expand their operating capacity. And so that's what you've seen, and Intrepid is.
And answer your question about DMCs. So you raise an important point there about DMCs. They've always been a part of the tour operator business model. And as companies like Intrepid have grown, they've acquired more DMCs. They've expanded their operating capacity. The ideal scenario is that you have control over the on-trip experience, either by operating it yourself or operating with partners that you know and trust and have full confidence in. The reality is that many customers may not have understood is that if they're going to South America, and I won't name the companies, but you would have booked with two different known brands, but it will be the same local DMC that is operating that product in that destination, that is literally changing their shirts, changing their, the sign on the coach, and then operating as another brand. And that's part of but they do that to be consistent with the brand experience. So there's a lot more to it in terms of making sure that they adhere to the itinerary that the team has built and so forth. So, but what's really interesting is that, and say it's not just Exotica, there's companies like Tourlane as well. The idea that you can actually now get patched in directly to local DMCs. And I'll give you one other example that's also quite relevant to this. There's a company called Zicasso, based in Mountain View. Their business model is you get a quote for a trip, and they then send that out to 3 different DMCs who will then compete on your business. And so this is where it is becoming more interesting how the DMC model is getting better integrated by virtue of technology. Because if you look at those, look at an Exotica or a Tourlane, they're really kind of tech-enabled platforms that are connecting you to that supply. And but when you go back to a company like TourRadar, and this is what's interesting and still why their business is so successful and growing so rapidly, is that they actually tap into the travel agent communities. They actually have like 21,000 travel agents use their adventure booking engine to book adventure trips. So they've aggregated all of this supply. They work with Flight Center. They work with a number of the major travel agencies. And so a lot of their business actually still comes from travel agents. And I think that's important to understand. And the question becomes, to me, as companies like Exotica raise funding and spend more on marketing and raise awareness of this category, there is a sense of a rising tide will float all boats, that there's going to be just more interest in people in multi-day tour and adventure tours that will be choosing any number of these brands. So this is where I see it as much more of a blue ocean than a red ocean, at least at this stage, because the market share is expanding. It's no longer just about, it's not about trying to compete over a limited market share where it's a red ocean and people are competing against each other to shift market share. There is genuine growth for a number of players in this space. So for those entrepreneurs who are listening to this that are, or that are growing their businesses, and I know there's obviously many of them listen to this show and they're in the technology side. And it's like, there's never been a better time to be in this category, in this sector, because there is so much room for growth amongst these players. But there's definitely some interesting trends like that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was reading about in regard to Exotica is that they're going to test working with Despegar. So they're going to sort of test that whole OTA space, because up to now they've been, I guess it just has been rather difficult to get into that OTA space, and OTAs are saying we really can't sell this stuff, which would be interesting to hear from some of the bigger like experience OTAs, like Get Your Guide. I know Musement does sell multi-day, but anyway, so that'll be interesting. One of the things I'd like to just touch on a little bit here, obviously the digitization aspect is super important and a huge reason why the category is growing. Another, I imagine, would be just the size and shape and the demographic of that multi-day category. So to your point, Dan, years ago, it was groups of 40 people. Christian probably knows these very well from
Exactly.
a company like 40 people show up and they're all following one guide around, and it's so it had a stigma attached to it, like I'm not doing that unless I'm like 70 years old, and I'm not going to get into that. And now that's obviously changed with customer preferences, right? And so I'm interested in looking at what you see in terms of the demographic. What are people looking for? Private, custom. It seems to me there's a vast selection of multi-day in this, with customers now. So wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, the single greatest trend is small group adventures. And that is what these adventure travel suppliers have been well poised to deliver on, where they haven't been focused on the coach. They're focused on local transport, and also the adventure category for many reasons, which is more of a psychographic than a demographic, that people are genuinely interested in that style of travel, life-changing experiences, much more immersive, culturally relevant, nature, sustainability, all these things. That there's a general trend for consumer in that direction. But if you look at a brand like Colette, which is one of the largest in this space as well, the fastest growing product they have, in speaking to the team, and this is where having the Travel Trends podcast, I have the privilege not only to speak to you guys, but also interview many amazing guests and get some very clear updates on what's happening within their businesses. And speaking to the team at Colette, small group is up like 70% and growing. So small group is a key category for many of these multi-day tour brands. You look at Gate One, you look at there's so many players when you start adding up the number of multi-day tour players there are in the space, which is why sizing it up can be very difficult, because there actually are quite a few players. It is very fragmented, and to the point where having a lot of the bookings do take place offline. Another reason that it's challenging to size it. But if you look at the overarching trends, it's definitely small group adventures, and it's a little difficult for the larger brands to make this adjustment, because they're very focused on trying to fill a 54-person coach, and their business model is managed by yield. Obviously, Christian knows this all too well with coach tours, bus tours, and that experience. So adapting to that is obviously important for them, and some are obviously really excelling. The other thing I just wanted to point out, if that's all right, is this concept of demographics, because it's one thing to say the industry's growing, but the question is why? Is it not just because there's an interest in this category, but what's actually happening here? And I'm going to pose you a quick question to you guys. What do you think? And James Thornton very kindly shared this in our interview, which is one of the first that we do in the adventure series. Like, who is the target demographic for an adventure traveler with Intrepid? And I'll ask Christian, because he might be the closest to this. Who do you think is the target, the two primary target demographics or personas, like the age and gender, or for those travelers? What would you say?
I think right now they're going after female 20 to 35. Probably. And then there's probably like an older one as well.
So I'll stop you. Yeah. No,
okay.
I'm glad I asked you, because this is like, you are the 20 to 30 something is what people assume is probably the number one market is a 45-year-old female solo traveler, typically a teacher or a nurse, someone that's well-educated, has above average income, has the ability to take time off, has the interest in foreign travel, has a passport, all of those things. That's multi-day. When you take a population of America, like 350 million, you narrow it down very quickly to really a few million people that actually you can really truly market to, that have all of those factors that you could actually convince to take an international trip. And so you have to be very intentional. The second biggest demographic for them is a 62-year-old couple. And the 62-year-old, the distant third is someone in their 20s and 30s. So the 62-year-old couple, which is exactly the sweet spot for all these multi-day tour operators. And if we think about the demographics, here we are in 2024. This is the year where the youngest baby boomer turns 60. Half of the baby boomers are retired. The other half are going to be retired in the next few years. They don't want their kids to inherit a cent from them. And so they're going to do everything they possibly can in the next 10 years to travel as much as possible. So that's one fascinating phenomenon. That's driving a lot of this activity, repeat. And then the other factor is when you actually look at the millennial traveler is spending more on travel as a part of their disposable income than ever before. And they see it as a right, not a privilege. And so they're outspending, they're taking also more frequent trips. So you see across, and the last thing I'll say on this topic, and I find this fascinating too, we've never in the course of human history had 6 generations of travelers traveling at the same time. I'm talking from the silent generation to the Xennials of today. You know, when you look through, I've only mentioned 2 categories so far, baby boomers and millennials. The reality is there's 6 generations of travelers. So there's all these incredible niches within this space of other companies that are just being started that are serving, you know, the cycling trips and really kind of niche categories. So that's why I say it's never been a better time to be in this space to evolve your product and to reach new customers, because there's going to be sustained demand. So back to very final thing I'll say on this is the growth trajectory. When we think about multi-day tour and we think about investors getting into this space, is that there's very few categories that can plan for literally a 20% compound annual growth rate for the next decade. The average for this industry is looking like 18%. And I say this from speaking to ATTA, Adventure Travel Association, speaking to Shannon Stoll, who's also one of the people that we interview. They're going to do a new study to size up the market. Their last study was saying that adventure travel is about $750 billion already. He's convinced it's already over $1 trillion. But anecdotally, looking at all the travel adventure suppliers, the average growth rate is 15 to 20%. Some are seeing 30 or 40%. So that's, you know, very real. And if that's sustained, you can imagine as an investor in this category, how rewarding that has the potential to be over the next decade if you're getting a 20% compound annual growth rate. And what that, so it's, and Shannon mentions this specifically, it's 20% growth on 20% growth, right? Year after year. So it's 20% growth on the size of the industry today, which is again, what makes it so appealing and exciting.
I have a few questions and thoughts and points. I want to bring it to our industry, which is primarily single day, which really is the comparison, single day, multi-day, right?
Yeah.
Adventure is a little bit different, and I want to talk about that as well. But if the main part of the market are people like Intrepid, G Adventures, Travel Corp, and a lot of them are getting their product from DMCs, isn't it true that a lot of DMCs are getting their product from single day operators? So if you're going to run a tour through Peru, Cambodia, the US market, and you're going to stop in New York or DC or Boston, that you're probably going to get a single day operator who's an expert in New York, DC, Boston for a certain type of thing. And what I've really struggled to figure out, and would love to hear your point of view, is where is that connection between the single day operator and the DMC, more likely outside the US, or the tour operator? Because we're not seeing that in Arrival, like at our events. We're not getting multi-day or DMCs to come to find new product. And I don't understand why, because that's where the core of the product lives, is with the folks that are doing those one-day adventures and activities.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, and you're absolutely right that in many cases these day tour operators. And I'll give you an exact example. There's a company called Impulse Travel in Colombia. I'm on their board. I'm very excited about this company and their potential, because they're in a major growth market. They operate day tours, and they operate day tours for the main players, Viator and other, and they do an incredible job of that. But they're also now introducing a lot more multi-day tour offerings, and then trying to figure out, do they sell direct? Do they sell through intermediaries? And I think that's exactly what's happening with a lot of these local DMCs. And this is the heart of our business, and why I love coming to Arrival, because it's all these small mom and pop operators from all over the world that come to be a part of that event, that are trying to figure out, how do I use technology? How do I meet distribution partners? How do I grow my business? And so I think even us having this discussion together highlights the need for more of those DMCs to tap into the multi-day tour opportunity, because it has been so limited today. I mean, I've worked closely with Viator to get multi-day tour product listed on their platform, but when you actually look at their restrictions, it's refundable up to 1 day in advance. The policies that most of the day tour operators have do not work for multi-day. you have to have the entire payment done 30 days in advance. So we've tried to work with those partners, and they can't change their business model. They also don't necessarily have the technology to be dynamic enough to be able to load pricing in multiple currencies. You can't just pivot off USD. If you're a true multi-day tour operator in many different regions, it's a complexity to source product and to price it, which is why they always kind of launch pricing in a brochure. It was set for the season because they had to manage pricing fluctuations with currencies. And so this is something that a lot of the technology today in day tour can't even handle multi-day, which is why when you see experts like Tour Radar, and why they have a strong competitive advantage is because they've built their product around the APIs from these multi-day tour providers to be able to build in the information that will convince a consumer to take that trip, but also manage all the flexibility about trips running back to back and how people book tours. It's quite different than a day tour experience. So just to finish on your point, I actually think it would be great for people listening to this that are going to be at Arrival or connect with each of you to actually start to wrap their head around multi-day, because it has been to date a few larger players that control the majority of the industry. And I think you're going to see more and more smaller companies springing up as well. They're going to challenge some of those incumbents. And that's also exciting as well for consumers and for entrepreneurs.
So I want to reserve the right to come back to a whole different second point. But first, I want to defer to Christian on what Dan just said. You're a single day operator in San Francisco, and you know lots of them. We all know lots of them. And I don't understand why it would be hard to do what Dan said and integrate your product through tech, DMCs, or inbound tour operators in San Francisco, California, wherever, that could then be packaged up and sold to multi-day operators. Like where's the gap in the tech to be able to, so that you can put what you sell in San Francisco to all these huge multi-day operators?
There's no gap. I mean, it happens today, right? So I'm a bus company, so we're less useful to a multi-day because they've generally got a coach for their 2 weeks or whatever. And that's
I'm telling you, just pretend you're
if I'm a boat company, I'm doing this today. I'm selling my boat, my 1 hour bay cruise to multi-day operators. I'm doing that all day long. That's already happening because they can skip the DMC in a place like San Francisco, or it goes through a DMC. So it is happening, and those deals are more likely to happen at IPW for the US, or a rendezvous in Canada, or so I think for the major cities, these are happening.
Yeah, I think DMCs are somewhat old school still a little bit, and they don't show up at some of these conferences, and the world of attractions is still not as important to them as accommodations and flights and getting, all of that's the bigger piece of the pie for them, really. But I agree with you, Christian. I mean, they're doing it now. We do it all day long, as you said. It's people are doing it.
So the rise of multi-day is bringing up the single day, are also benefiting. It's just another distribution channel, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
The only thing I would just add to it, though, just to be clear, when we're talking about multi-day, is that you'll see some of the day tour operators that say, we have multi-day because we have 3-day trips. And that's clearly, that is in the technical definition, you could say that's multiple days. But a true multi-day tour is at least 5 days. The sweet spot for multi-day tour is more like 7 to 10. And some people take 2-week or 3-week long multi-day tour trips. And so I think that's an important differentiation. Like if you go to Tour Radar, you're not going to find less than 5-day itineraries.
I do have one other thing, if I could.
Yep.
Talk about market sizing. And Shannon says it's already $1 trillion market. Shannon is adventure travel, so that's his number. And you started when you talked about, I couldn't tell if you were talking about multi-day or adventure, or you're combining them. Adventure travel, that $1 trillion number, I always wonder. I think he's counting go out fishing, camping, like things that aren't run through tour operators. It's just people going out and enjoying the outdoors. And, I'd like to understand what that number is, versus the business you're talking about of the actual multi-day tour operators. I don't care if they're adventure or sightseeing. And what are they driving? And is it $1 trillion? I doubt it. Is it 100 billion? Probably at least, maybe 200. So I just wanted to differentiate between that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. And when I spoke to Shannon, and people can obviously listen to this interview depending on when they're listening to this on travel trends, and you can listen to Shannon, you can listen to James, you can listen to Erica DeSanti from We Road, and be informed from all of the insights that they share. But Shannon, actually, that number does encompass all aspects of adventure travel, like hiking and like so it's not just multi-day tour in that number. That's not, and the two are not the same. So you're absolutely right that is encompassing a much wider array of and hard and soft adventures. That's another category within the space. Or hard adventures, obviously the more active adventures. Soft adventures is what we associate more with multi-day tour guided tours, which is why you have 62-year-olds that are the primary demographic, right? That would otherwise not have been, that would have been put off by this category because they think it would be too much physical exertion, too onerous, that it's going to be hiking, it's going to be kayaking. And that is a small part, but it's literally 20% of the adventure category is those types of hard adventures. So back to your point, and this is where when I'm sizing the market and having these discussions with investors, because I work a lot with VCs that are investing in travel startups to help them scale. And so the number, just like I mentioned with Tour Radar, is more like 300 billion is actually probably a better market size for multi-day tour, going from the 100 to 200 to 300 and also growing. So yeah, that's probably a better or more accurate market size. But I would love for Arrival, Focusrite, anyone listening to this that wants to tackle this, because it's like a keystone project for any MBA that just wants to make their career, size this industry and get a real true sense.
Sounds
and
like your piece of homework, Dan. I don't know. Hey, we are almost out of time, but we wanted to just talk a little bit about kind of customization and innovation. So obviously multi-day tour, most of what you're talking about is like the same group of people that are kind of moving about, and they're moving about together. You think about things like cost management, you've got to be operating in that fashion to, make the tour affordable. But then there's also this idea of sort of mass customization and personalization, and how do you structure an opportunity for somebody that maybe wants to travel, is just the two of them, and is there a pick and choose concept that you could potentially use that still delivers a multi-day tour, but isn't necessarily with the same group of people all the time? And then I guess I also want to talk a little bit about, or I'd like to have Christian weigh in on kind of how do you innovate in this space? And is it that sort of idea of mass customization and efficiency? Is there a way to personalize the opportunity or the multi-day experience? So maybe first, Christian, you could weigh in on sort of where do you see this? And then Dan, perhaps you could finish off with that.
Yeah, it may get me back to the same place, but I was just thinking about innovation. So, and this might take us away, but let's try and bring it back around. So one, I'm looking at all the layers, right? So you've got Google at the top, then Tour Radar, then the brand, that Intrepid, then DMC, then the local bus owner or restaurant or whatever. That's a lot of layers, right? So first off, what I was going to ask you, and I think hopefully it ties back, is if you started again, if you were designing this industry from ground up, which layers would you get rid of? And that's really the question there, is where's it going to end up? And if it is going to change, if we're going to have fewer layers, that's innovation. That's an opportunity for someone to come in and and flatten things out. And then maybe that links up to what Laurie's asking. Is it all about customization? And is that another gap for innovators to come in and solve? Maybe one of the biggest places people should be, if I was a startup today in this space, where would I go if I've been given $10 million to disrupt the industry?
Before Dan answers, I want to add a layer, which is travel agent.
Yeah, that would be instead of Google, right?
Well, no, Google travel agent could start with
Google travel agent,
or the customer could start at Google and then walk into the travel agency, call them, whatever, and say, hey, but travel agent, Dan, you said, is still a huge part of the industry.
That cuts out Tour Radar, but yeah, anyway, yeah.
No, really excellent questions. And I'll try and be succinct to my responses because I want to address each of them. But what I would say first is that when you look at the evolution of this category, really you're talking about package tours or package holidays. Going way back, obviously Thomas Cook, and we think about how, 1950s, end of the industry that we know really was shaped at the end of the Second World War, right? People started going on these package holidays. Once you all of a sudden had a rising middle class that could afford to go on trips, because up until that point, it was really for the very wealthy to be able to do these incredible global trips. So 1950s, 1960s, air travel. So the idea of building out packaged holidays, and we think a lot of those as like sun destinations, right? It's like give me something that has my flight, my accommodation, everything all included. All-inclusive trips, which is a massive sector, but it's far larger than the multi-day tour sector. And this is where when you see the opportunity for multi-day tour, people trading away from, and the reason I'm using that as an example is because a multi-day tour is a package tour. At the end of the day, usually with the exception of a flight. When you look at the prices, it's what we refer to as land, right? Land only. So you have to get yourself to the destination, but once you're there, you have a guide, you get on a coach, you have your transport taken care of, your accommodation. So it's a package holiday. The one thing that our industry has done a really good job of is decompartmentalizing, like the OTAs have made it possible for you to build your own package holiday, book your flight, book your hotel, book your car, book your activities. And so now you're actually literally building your own holiday. Some people like being self-directed, and obviously there is self-guided tours as an option. But the very concept of a package holiday in and of itself is actually what appeals to a large group of customers that want to book this type of trip. Because the time and effort that it takes not only to assemble your own trip, but also all that decision making, if you can have a turnkey solution, and this is where I still see such relevance for these types of trips today, is that a customer can just see the offering that they're interested in. It's going to have the destination that they're keen on. It's going to have the types of activities that they're interested in. And I think one of the things that we're fundamentally missing, and I think this is where, just to your question, Lori, about trying to make these trips independent, one of the inherent benefits of group travel is it is truly social travel, and it's the human connection. And you'll hear each of these leaders of these brands talk about that. And you'll hear about life-changing adventures. You'll talk about the loneliness epidemic. You'll hear the concept of social travel. And there's many reasons why in this virtual world today, where we're spending so much time on social media and we're feeling more disconnected than ever, that there's also another human driver for people to want to come together on these trips and have a shared experience. And for any of us that have been on a true adventure tour, my first one was an Intrepid. And I was an independent traveler, hardcore independent traveler before, Lonely Planet guide, backpack, staying at hostels. And I kind of saw myself as an independent traveler. As someone alerted to me after a few years of working at Lonely Planet, is that I was actually on a packaged holiday without even realizing it, because I'm literally going to the same hotels on the same tour. Like I'm meeting other Lonely Planet travelers. I didn't have a guide, but I had a guidebook. And so when I started to take a guided tour and really understood the category, and this is where when people experience a true guided tour and have an amazing time, they come back. And that's another thing about this sector, is a very high repeat rate, and people will book long-term and they'll mix it in with other holidays. They may do a sun holiday. The average booking, when we look at repeat rates, it's more like 18 to 24 months than 12 months, because they don't necessarily do a multi-day tour every year, but they'll do a beach holiday and then they'll come back for that trip to Peru or to. So to answer your question about what the last thing that I didn't cover, I realize, is the importance and relevance of travel agents. So here's a really interesting thing as we stand here in 24 going into 2025. One of the big challenges for any of these travel companies is the cost of direct consumer acquisition, right? To be direct consumer, there's a high cost and we see that with the OTAs. I mean, some of them spend literally 60% of their budget on marketing. And that's not necessarily sustainable in categories that necessarily don't have as large a margin. And so when you look at the relevance of travel advisors today, and I guess came into this business in an era where everyone was in the .com, the travel advisors were going to go away. And I sit here on the cusp of going to Virtuoso again, that did 32 billion in gross sales last year. And you just look at how massively the travel advisor business is growing and selling products like wellness or adventure, is because if they can acquire a customer, if these tour operators can acquire a customer at or lower than what it would cost them to go direct, then it absolutely makes sense for them to continue to support that model. So as exciting as some of these brands are that are being disruptive, where they're going direct to consumer and trying to cut out intermediaries and trying to reduce price that way, the reality is they're going to have to pay for that cost per acquisition. And they're spending a lot of money on marketing to do that. And that's always a question, is how sustainable is that going to be?
Yeah. And I think the distribution part of it is just like another whole conversation. And you know, lots of ways of getting the word out there, but I think the traditional travel channels have been very successful in selling this kind of a category. So, okay, we've got one more question left, and I think I don't have to ask Dan because I already know the answer. Christian, would you take a multi-day tour with the group and travel around, same group, you're going to all the same places, traditional multi-day tour? Would you take one of those?
It's not my kind of thing, but I still feel like I'm 25, so I do like a Trek America type thing around the national parks. But Dan just reminded me when my first backpacking trip, I went to Mexico. I was riding a pedicab in San Francisco, and I went to Mexico for a month, and I planned this for like a month. I got a map and I planned the whole thing. And the first hostel on the first night, I showed a guy my whole itinerary. I didn't book anything, but I showed him the plan. And he said, "Oh yeah, the Gringo Trail." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "That's what everyone does." I'm like, I may as well have booked a multi-day trip, just like Dan said, right? Because we all end up back at the same places and we all think we're independent. But as Dan said, you're just doing a lot more work for possibly the same results. So after what Dan said, I might think about it. It kind of, I see the appeal.
Okay, Bruce?
You know, I'm gonna say something that Dan mentioned at the beginning, we didn't get a chance to come back to, which I would book a small group private multi-day. So if I could have my private group, 5, 10, 15 people,
Yeah,
and we get to customize a multi-day trip, absolutely. I mean, that would be like my ideal kind of trip. Getting on a coach with 40 strangers, not so much.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I think it would be a small group experience. I would definitely be amenable to that. And I think to your point, Dan, about community, I feel like that is becoming more and more interesting to me all the time. Just different communities, and you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. What's your favorite tour you've been on, Dan?
well, so it'd have to be my first tour, because the reality is, so a lot of people travel solo, and that's one of the reasons, obviously, they take group tours, they travel solo. I was already married at the time. My wife and I, we went to Southeast Asia, and we went for the first time to Southeast Asia, and we did our Intrepid trip that we arrived in Bangkok, and we went overland through Cambodia to Ho Chi Minh. We went along the Mekong and we crossed the border crossing. And all of that was so intimidating and overwhelming at the time. For those of us that grew up with Vietnam War films, to be crossing over a land border with someone wearing the red star and giving your passport across, and it was a surreal experience. It was not certainly something I would have been comfortable with at the time as a independent traveler crossing that border. And so, but once we had crossed over, we then spent a month traveling in Vietnam independently, had the most incredible time and beautiful people, and then spent 6 weeks in Thailand. But it was like, it gave us an opportunity to get comfortable in the destination. So that one was always very memorable for me, because, and this is where I hope that, if anything in our conversation today, is we just inspire more people to travel, see the world, connect with others, other cultures. And like, that's obviously ultimately my passion and interest. I'm just an avid traveler. And this is one of, I believe, one of the great ways to travel. And I hope that we should organize a custom trip, because your original question is spot on, Bruce, is that most people, and one of my colleagues that are in this space, they organize like a family reunion, and they book out a coach and they do a trip, but they do a custom itinerary just for their family group, because they love that style of travel. But how would you love it all that much more if it was all people that you loved and cared about, and you could go and experience one of these destinations together? So,
Well, we've got to say goodbye now, but thanks for joining us. And Dan, it's been really a pleasure to have you join us today, and learned a lot about multi-day. So stay tuned for the next conversation about that. And cheers for now.